it's for us as young activists, creatives. Yeah, it's foundational text. And also the Battle of Salt River is unpacked within that book. And we are honored here this evening by his blessings and his presence. And we give you a lot of support, sir, for your struggles that you're going through. The loss of your first partner, and for still making time for us. We are grateful and thankful, and we are also with you in your grief. And yeah, we pass our blessings and we pass our condolences up to these. But that's all I can say. So he's a legend, and blessing us with the inaugural Roots Culture Heritage and Decolonization Week. We are thankful. So the stage is yours. Thank you, Mr. Mellet.
Good evening, everybody. I'm in a bit of a spiritual, emotional state at the moment where I'm half in the world of the dead and half in the world of the living, moving in and out mentally. My children's mother died yesterday, and we'd been with a 5-day vigil. We had to turn off her life support, and it wasn't an easy decision, and we're still trying to cope with all of that. So, luckily last week I was preparing for this evening because I want to present some substantial things on this anniversary. And I typed it up. So you get to forgive me that I'm going to read a lot to you rather than speak impromptu, because my thoughts will just jumble. Maybe just before that, so that I can follow up with what my brother was saying. I take it you were in the 1980s generation, is it? Now, 10 years before, we had the 1976 generation, which was mine. And of course, we had running battles here in Adley Street, getting shot at and all of this kind of thing. I was, in the custody of the security police and military for almost 2 years, had a gun put in my mouth, threatened to be killed and all of that. And at that time, this partner of mine was the only person that really knew what I was going through. Unlike the 1980s, there weren't mass movements, there weren't networks. It was a very lonely time to be involved, and we were just teenagers. I wasn't able to finish school. We were from a poor scenario, and I was out working at the age of 15, 16 in the factory. But we knew what was right and what was wrong. My mother's granny was a Damaskakwe woman. She married a Scotsman in the Eastern Cape, and her daughter in turn married an Englishman. On my father's side, my 5th great-grandmother was a Kokokwa woman, and her 2 daughters married 2 French brothers. And then we have 28 people from Africa and Asia in our family who were enslaved from various parts of the world. And of course, about 21 Europeans who, many of them were non-conformists and crossed the color line as rebels. So just to give you that little picture of who I am and where I come from. I served in the liberation movement, and so did my partner. When I was driving across here, I thought about one incident in Zambia. We would get a warning. We would sleep with AK and grenades next to our bed and so on. But at this particular time, the Zambian government confiscated our arms. And we get these warnings at a moment's notice, in the middle of the night, we are going to be attacked within the half-hour move, just disappear into the night. And we had a 18-month, 20-month-old child, and my wife took up the child in the sling, I took the rucksack, and at that time, because our arms had been taken away, I had a knife. And as we moved into the dark, a soldier in fatigues, blackened face, came out of the bush, grabbed me by the neck, and I shouted to my wife to run while I went into a knife fight. She didn't run. She turned around, "You bastard!" And she, defiance, that's how she was. She was a feisty woman. And this bull, or whoever it was that in the fatigues that had attacked us, melted back, because I counter-attacked with the knife, melted back into the bush. And I suddenly remembered it all as I was driving here. As I say, you move in and out of life and death when you're in the state that I'm in at the moment. I don't even know why I'm talking about these stories, but you inspired me with your remembrances and so on. And I had the unfortunate thing of being, even in a worse situation, not coloured, other coloured. That was one of the 7 categories of coloured. That our family, it was a peculiar time when I was a child youngster, because this is when they were introducing this. My one cousin, who is, I was going to say blacker than anybody in the room, but then I saw the brother there, and he was black like that, and dark hair. But his sister had blonde hair and blue eyes. And he had a European ID card. And he had to go to Home Affairs and tell them, you can shove this European up where the sun don't shine, because it's giving me too much, people are calling me a fraud and all of that. Just give me that coloured card. That was some of the indignities that we had to go through. But colleagues, tonight, comrades, friends, I want to talk to you about the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference, the carve-out of Africa. I'm going to challenge in this some of the terms that we use that we think are okay, but are actually not. I will end with the story of Salzburg, and I will end with the story of Adwa. So forgive me that I'm leading to you. Normally I'm conversational. One of the evilest words and concepts for indigenous Africans is the European idea of nations. It has a horrible and an oppressive history in Africa. The idea of nations and nationalism only emerged in Europe in the late 18th century, and everything to do with competition of European states for identity and supremacy after the French and American revolutions. And part of those struggles for supremacy was how much of the world each sovereign imperial power could possess as colonies. This European idea of nations was deeply rooted in racism and white supremacy, and narrow ideas of ethnicity, culture, and language, and hierarchies of dominance. The notion of nations was brutally forced on Africans, who were forced by the Europeans into countries called nation states, where the Europeans decided where the borders would be. The Europeans decided that Africans could be defined into ethnic groups or tribes. A very derogatory word. Europeans don't use it for themselves. They talk about social groups, societies, not tribes. They talk about civilizations. And when it comes to Africa, the uncivilized, the heathen. This is the kind of language of supremacy. And they also had these ideas that were rooted in racism, false historical narratives, the creation of families of languages where they used the term Bantu languages, Khoisan languages, and later on they would talk about Bantu races and Khoisan races, and then they would describe subhuman race as a qualification, and so on. They employed a methodology known as divide, conquer, and rule. In the process, the Europeans committed acts of genocide across Africa and used local Africans to also commit genocide on each other on behalf of the Europeans. And here in southern and central Africa, this was most felt in the Congo and in Namibia and in parts of South Africa. In Eritrea, in Tigray and Ethiopia, they used what they called askaris. And then the askari phenomenon spread through all the different European colonies. The great German genocide in Namibia saw 100,000 Herero exterminated, 20,000 Kum and Nama exterminated in concentration camps, death camps. In fact, the guy who invented the word Khoisan in 1928, in 1905, he was operating from a concentration camp in Namibia, where he was cutting off the heads of Kum and Nama people to send to Germany for studies. They were doing human experiments in those. His name was Leonard Schulze-Jenner, and he was the first man to coin the phrase Khoisan. In South Africa, 15,000 San people between 1740 and 1790 were killed. They were, sorry, just let me get my place here. They were exterminated by the European General Commando. What a lot of people don't know was that 80% of the General Commando were Cape Khoi Askaris, our own people used to exterminate the San. And these Askaris of the Cape were used against their fellow Africans, whom the Europeans designated to be an animal species that they called Bushmen, the San. The Khoi were encouraged to make the Aboriginal San a subordinated and assimilated people of the Khoi, and from this emerged this use of the word San as an appendage to Khoisan. It is unfortunate today that some use this evil European terms and colonial concepts of nation as a label to identify themselves, and use an equally terrible derogatory European term tribe as a label to identify themselves. This is the result of racist apartheid and colonial education and literature that is unfortunately and unthinkingly used to educate ourselves without questioning it. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a meeting of the imperialist human powers that partitioned Africa for colonization. The conference established rules, and in fact laws, for dividing Africans and Africa's resources and trade across the continent. The conference did not include any representatives from Africa, and resulted in the signing of what was called the General Act of Berlin, which regulated European colonization and trade in Africa. It was in fact the first emergence of an act of European Union, long before the EU of today. Initially, the EU itself was a failed project that lay at the heart of Nazi Germany. Hitler lost the war, but his ideas of a united Europe, with Germany at its center, actually survived. But it's through this Berlin Conference in 1884-85 that countries, borders, and nations were created in Africa. It was not Africans who created these things. And you go and look at these borders, you take an African map and you look at these borders, many of them consist of straight lines. They didn't care where those lines went through a village, through a family, through an area of people where one part of that social group was on one side of the border and on the others on the other side. South Africa was only created 115 years ago. You know, everybody says, why can't we all just be South Africans? As if there's something great about this term, South Africa. It was only created 115 years ago, and most of the population were not part of it. Were actually told you were not citizens of this South Africa. It was a white South Africa. You know, it's not a long time ago. The ground rules of the Berlin Conference 140 years ago was used to create this thing we call South Africa, where two warring parties amongst the colonists, the English and the Dutch. I hesitate to use the word Afrikaner. I will explain to you why later on.
Yes.
Directly translated, it is
Exactly.
African.
Exactly.
So let's deal with it in a moment. The conference in Berlin established a legal claim for Europeans to occupy all of Africa, exploit its resources and its people. And then after World War II, and particularly in the 1960s, the Europeans shifted away from direct colonization to neo-colonization. So they allowed the elites in various African countries to come to power, to have flags, to get proud of these national boundaries that the Europeans had given us, and so neo-colonialism took over, and South Africa and the Chagos Archipelago were the last African countries to shift from colonial to neo-colonial status. In fact, Chagos, it only happened last year. That was the last African territory to gain a kind of independence. When I say a kind of independence, it was conditional that they become part of Mauritius. And Diego Garcia, which remains a military base for the British and the Americans, is contractually protected in their favor for at least the next 100 years. So we still have that outpost in Africa. So who was involved in this Berlin conference? It was Great Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Italy, Russia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States. People think that the United States wasn't. They thought this, many people think this is just a European affair. And what's important, brother from the Congo, was we associate the Congo problem just with the Belgians, H, on the other side, the Portuguese. But what America got out of the Berlin conference was control over the waterway, the river, the Congo River. And it had very much to do with American industry, because America wrote into the Berlin conference its own protection laws around trade. So it's important to understand the full nature of imperialism. The Russians may have been minor players, but they also got a piece of territory in northeast Africa to look after their interests in the Middle East, in North Africa, and East Africa. So while the USA did not get a piece of Africa, its support at the conference for Germany and Belgium influenced the declaration of the Congo Basin as a free trade area. And the USA ensured that its commercial interests in Africa were protected. So it's not accidental that war and chaos exists today in the DRC, and that Rwanda is involved to the hilt in this mischief. These Western countries have interests in both DRC and in Rwanda, and they are playing everybody against each other. It has a long history that goes back to the USA role in the Berlin Conference. Russia only got a small part of African land on the Horn of Africa, but this was able to secure its trade routes and sphere of influence. Russia too has a long history of involvement in colonialism in Africa, albeit a lesser role than others. Tsar Peter the Great was a very good friend of the Cape Governor Simon van der Stel, and he was a patron also of the Dutch East India Company's shipping group. The Russians were also supporters of the Boers in the Boer War, which resulted ultimately in the Union of South Africa. What the Europeans did when the Union was formed and when the Berlin Conference happened was to linguistically divide Africa into Francophone, Lusophone, Anglophone, Germanic and Italophone regions, and the politics of the imperial powers set the parameters for political and administrative practices in all of these nation countries created by the Europeans in each region. So African territories effectively became little France, little England, little Italy, little Germany, little Spain, little Portugal. And Africans became conscripts into the armies of these imperialist forces. You know, I think it was something like almost 500,000 Africans served in the French forces during World War II. Just to give you an idea of the scale. The Europeans actively promoted what they called tribalism and competitive nationalism amongst Africans as part of the process by feeding populations with historical myths and lies. And this is continuing to this day. In South Africa, over 120 diverse African societies, not tribes, societies, existed in the 19th century. And by 1910, these were artificially divided into two groups, one called natives and the other called colored, largely separated on the basis of false history and language. So over 80 societies were grouped together as natives, and they were later called Bantu, and then even later after 1977, because of the fight against Bantu education, P.W. Botha was very clever. He took the word black from Black Consciousness Movement and he turned it into an ethnic term, blacks, to replace Bantu. But what they did in 1910 was to take over 80 African societies and panel beat these into 10 linguistic groups. So they talked about the Xhosa nation, the Zulu nation, the Pedi nation, Tswana nation, and so on. But in fact, there were many societies in each of those categories. What the colonialists did, it was a problem for them because they couldn't manage it. It was too big, it was too diverse. There were too many people who were elders of authority within those societies. So they had to panel beat them into these 10 groups, and then they had to bless leaders who would cooperate with them. It was a terrible system. There was over, sorry, let me get my place again, yeah, sorry. There were over 40 societies who were collectively defined as colored. And the reason they did this, again, was on, when they defined the 10 groups, they based this on those groups that spoke languages that could be classified as Bantu languages. Now, there are over 700 ethnicities in Africa, 700 societies across Africa, who speak languages that can be related to this family of languages that another German, Wilhelm Bleek, the father of race classification, he created the term Bantu, and he called these languages, the 700 peoples and languages, the Bantu languages. It was just a short step from there that they then referred to the Bantu race. And then the 40 other societies that then went under the term colored, these were people who spoke a range of what we call the Nama, Kharkhadi, Kharib, Kwadi family of languages, which has a number of languages within there. These are languages associated with the different San peoples and with the various Khoi peoples. And then people also spoke Afrikaans and Kaaps and English, and had 195 different roots of origin, predominantly African, and also Asian and Eurasian, some European as well. Although these groups had different distinguishing characteristics, all had common ancestors. So whether you were San or Khoi, or whether you came from the foundation people that we call the Kalundu Urewe, who are the Bantu language speakers, whether you came from any of those, you were not pure. So Kwe, San, Urewe, Kulundu, the mix is there. And if you take the DNA today, if you take the DNA of the Kung, for instance, and the DNA of the Chua, and the DNA of the Kwe, these are San groups. But 70% of their DNA relates to Bantu language speakers. And likewise, if you take the Amaxhosa, about 20% relate to the San and to the Kwe, and 80% to the Kulundu Rewe traditions. If you take Kwe groups like the Damara, their language and so on is Kwe, but their DNA relates to, and the same with the Damasqua in the Eastern Cape, my great-grandmother's people. Our ancestors didn't practice apartheid. They intermarried, they had children together, they came up with new ethnic group names, they ditched those later and took on even new ones. The names that we have today are actually not that old, because there were older ones before that, and before that even older ones. And we can trace our movements right across Africa, from Northeast Africa, Ethiopia, right through to Southern Africa, and not just as one, but as a kind of almost a washing machine movement over 200,000 years. We are Africans. That's what it means when we say Africans, rather than we are these ethno-nationalist identities. So, although all of these groups had different distinguishing characteristics, all also had common ancestors and shared some language and cultural commonalities. Africans didn't practice apartheid. This was something the Europeans introduced. All of South Africa's peoples have ancestors, cultures, spiritual and language traits that go back to the Aboriginal San Foundation people, as well as to the Kwe and the Kulundu Rewe Foundation peoples. Colonialism, imperialism and apartheid have used historical lies and promoted antagonisms to divide the many societies which descend from the San, Kwe, and the Kulundu Rewe Foundation peoples. It is all of this that we remember today on the anniversary of the Berlin Conference. So what is it that we need to understand and avoid when we engage in what I call restorative memory about this history? The biggest lesson that we need to be conscious of is that the Europeans used nation states, nations, and competing nationalisms, along with concepts of ethnicism, tribalism, racism, culture, and language differences, to weaken and divide us, to make us fight with each other, while they robbed the land, the livestock, and the mineral resources. And it goes on till today. To this day, Africans are fighting amongst ourselves, while the Europeans laugh at us and steal what we have. In South Africa, we should be highly aware that the divisions between those of us classified as coloured and those classified as black are artificially created by the Europeans. We are all Africans, we are not coloured. We are San, Kekwe, Korana, Nama, Griqua, Kamisa Africans, and our brothers and sisters who share San and Kwe ancestry with us are fellow Africans like Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, Pedi, Tswana, Ndebele, Venda, Swati, Tsonga. It is a falsehood that those called blacks have no San and Kwe ancestry. They do. And they are not alien colonial invaders, as some people say, who turned up in the 1400s to steal the land of the San and the Kwe. You know, the Europeans said this was an empty land. And they qualified this empty land to say, well, there were some sort of half people here called Bushmen. One woman, Mary Barber, who was the founder of anthropology, the subject of anthropology in South African academia, she talked about the San or the Bushmen as this relative swinging in the trees, just one step down from the animal life. That's how she described it in official anthropology. By the way, she was a self-taught anthropologist. She made it up, but she's considered to be the mother of anthropology in South Africa. We have a scenario which we can track back now through paleontology, through archaeology, through DNA, genetics, through linguistics, through a whole range of means, paleo art and so on, that show us that there was mixing in South Africa between 3,000 and 2,000 years ago of different peoples, not in the 1400s, as we are told. And Africans never practiced apartheid and race and ethnic separateness, as it's the same form of division of the Berlin Conference, which they created in 1885. The Berlin Conference that divides Africans and the creation of the Union of South Africa to entrench white supremacy and divide Africans left a legacy of deep division. In South Africa in 1875, two men born in the Netherlands immigrated to Cape Town, and they started a white African nationalist movement. They took control of the name of the Kwe, African dynasty known as the Oorlam Afrikaners, and they took their language called Afrikaans. And the Boers at that time hated the term Afrikaner because it meant African. The Boers also called Afrikaans Otmotstaal. They didn't like it because they spoke Cape Low Dutch. But these two Dutchmen from Amsterdam, they weren't born here even. They were from Amsterdam, Pannevis and Hugenhout. They launched an Afrikaner nationalist movement called the Genootskap van Regte Afrikaners, in opposition to what they saw as die verkeerde swart Afrikaners. That's 150 years ago, just 150 years ago. Before then, there was no talk of Afrikaner and no laying claim to the language of Afrikaans. So it's a very recent thing. Just like Dr. Verwoerd, you know, he was also born in the Netherlands. And he came from a right-wing fascist background, and he came to South Africa and he became the father of apartheid. So these guys in AfriForum who start talking about their 370 years in South Africa, it was Dutchmen. Verwoerd was a Dutch-born man in the 20th century. Pannevis and Hugenhout were Dutchmen born in the Netherlands. In fact, Hugenhout was a criminal. He was arrested here for theft and fraud, and he spent 5 years in jail. This is the bias founder of Afrikaner nationalism amongst the Europeans. Sorry, I'm just losing my place here. The Europeans were the first to introduce this notion of firstism, that they were here first, and that there was only a subhuman group of San. By the way, they didn't include the Kwe. The Kwe and the Xhosa were seen as the same invaders, according to the Europeans, when they claimed an empty land. They have a Latin term called terra nullius, which they declared for South Africa. All of this European nonsense, which even some of our own people in the Patriotic Alliance, and unfortunately also some amongst our brothers in the Queer Revivalists on the fringe of the Queer Revivalist movement, support some of these crazy beliefs. Some of them actually went with Boerevolk and Boerelegion, who are two of the constituents of AfriForum. They went to the United Nations to claim that the Afrikaners were indigenous Africans, lending their support. Recently, very recently, last year, some of these particular Khoi groups went to Israel, where they have the Israelis established a indigenous embassy for all indigenous peoples in the world who recognize that the Israelis are indigenous people of Palestine. And we had people standing up there from South Africa saying how much they supported the indigenous people of Israel and so on. And of course there's money involved in all of this sort of thing. So again, we are not united. We divide and we go and we align ourselves with terrible people in the world. So, coming to an end, you know, this whole thing of division, it's designed starting from what Bob Marley and Marcus Garvey call the oppression of the mind. And, you know, Bob Marley talked about, well, he actually took it from Marcus Garvey. Free yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. We have to start there. Because the War of Berlin Conference and the War of the Union of South Africa against us and the use of divide and rule all rely on mental manipulation. When your mind is imprisoned, it's the first part of imprisoning you. That's why they call it civilization. The Europeans say we're exporting civilization. Civilization is mind control, you know, in their sense of the word civilization. The first things they did with civilization was they took out the Bible and they said to you, people, don't believe these, you know, superstitions, they called them. That was the spiritual beliefs of Africa and Asia. They were superstitions. They were uncivilized. So the mind. You know, I think once Archbishop Tutu brought out this thing about Europeans came with the Bible and then asked people to kneel and pray, and when the people woke up,
The land was gone.
the Europeans had the land and the people had the Bible. You know, it might sound a little bit gimmicky, but that's what happened. That's what this whole civilization story was all about. The control of the mind, the mental slavery. And the tools of this was to get us to buy into narrow nationalism and so on. So, if we truly want to embrace liberation, then we need to put unity, African unity, foremost in our minds. We need to stop falling into the trap of divisions and hating each other and seeing one as being more first than the other. This is crazy. So, I'm ending with these two important lessons in African history. The lesson of the 1510 victory of the Khmer resistance to the Portuguese and the victory of the Ethiopian forces at Adwa on 1st of March 1896 is it shows us that a people united can never be defeated. You know, in the Latin American countries, it's a very big slogan in Spain. A people united can never be defeated.
Now say it in Spanish.
Means. No. I won't try that. I have grandchildren who are Spanish, but I can't. The historical accounts tell us that in, I don't know pasará, historical accounts tell us that in 1510, a foreign Haikwa village at Rondebosch. Now, there, as Bradlock said earlier, there are about very different accounts of what happened there. But only one of those accounts gives us a very exact position. And it says, 1 league from the Salt River beach, that is 6.2 kilometers from the beach at Salt River, along the old Khmer cattle tracks, now Lower Main Road and Main Road. An experienced party of Portuguese sailors, and that takes you, by the way, to Rondebosch. So the Khmer village was in Rondebosch. They had marched from the beachfront at Salt River. Now the beachfront at Salt Cape Town is not what it used to look like. The sea was just outside of this walls. So all of that land between, outside of this walls, across what you call the foreshore, that is reclaimed land. That was sea. Part of it was done in my lifetime and part in my mother's lifetime. When my mother was a youngster, there was sea. And they used to go on the Adley Street Pier. You know, Strand Street was called Strand Street because that was the beach. Strand is the beach. And that same beach road goes just the side of the railway line in Woodstock and Salt River. So, around about 200 meters from Bromwell Street in Salt River, which is just behind Salt River Circle, where the Salt River Market is. So 200 meters from Salt River Market was the beach. And that's where the fight took place. Now that beach was partly beach of the sea and partly beach of a estuary, the Salt River estuary. So everybody says, Salt River, where's the bloody river? There was a river that went right through there. The old, you see what is called the Leesbig River now and the Black River now are actually completely man-made, and they were only made in the last 100 years. Those were not the original rivers. The original river ran, you know where Black River Business Park is, where First Street is. It ran right through Hartleyvale Stadium and then all the way straight through to Salt River Circle and just behind Salt River Market into an estuary. And there was an island there called Pardon Island. Today there's part an island, but you don't see any island. That was sea all around there. So the battle takes place just behind Bromwell Street. If you take Bromwell Street and you take the railway line, you're talking about 200 meters. And if you go to Woodstock, you will see there's a road called Beach Road there. Same like Strand Street. When I was a kid, we still used to play on Woodstock Beach. At the container terminal of Cape Town Harbour had not been built. That was a beach that we used to play on still. So it was very different then. So now they come from there and they march all the way to this Khoi village in Rondebosch. But on the first day, they get into some bartering. And when it comes time to pay for the head of cattle, they refuse to pay. And they end up being cornered and chased. And they get back and they complain, and the following day, de Almeida and his entire captaincy of the fleet come ashore, and while the small boats are gone to go and fetch fresh water downstream at the Kamisa River, they decide, 150 of them, decide they're going to march on this and teach the Khoi a lesson. And they end up capturing children and women and cattle, and then the Khoi go for them. And 170 Khoi people, using the cattle as almost like a cavalry, as a barricade between them and the Portuguese, but also on the haka of the Portuguese, and using stones. Like Bradlock said, you can actually be pretty good with a stone. I was once pretty good with we were shot here in Adley Street, and as we were running, I saw this 3-4-year-old child Slottenton abandoned in the line of the police fire, and I grabbed the child, and the guy who was with me grabbed stopped the tear gas canister with his foot and threw it back at the police. We had our fights here too. So they drive, the Khoi drive them. It's a running battle from Rondebosch all the way through to the beach and the dunes at Saltram. And there they corner the guys on the beach, and the boats have gone off to get water, and they're trapped, and the Khoi slaughter the whole damn lot of them. The greatest general in Europe at that time was Francisco de Almeida. He heard everything from Bradley there. And so, a people that was considered to be tribalistic and primitive as opposed to civilized, actually conquered an army that couldn't be conquered all over the world. So, this is important things to learn, that it doesn't matter how we are told how weak we are. We can actually take on might. We all tremble at the US today, but we've got something, and they're not on our territory. This is our home territory. We need to stand up for ourselves. By standing together and consciously resisting, that decisive battle had the result of postponing European colonization at the Cape for 140 years. That the result of us not becoming a Portuguese colony, but ultimately a Dutch and an English colony. Even though having poor war technology, the standing together and commitment to resist defeated the world's most powerful army. After dividing up of Africa by the Berlin Conference, there were still some areas in which the Europeans were yet to gain hegemony and control. The Kingdom of Ethiopia was one of those areas. The Italians coveted the whole of Ethiopia, and the Berlin Conference gave them the right to attack and subjugate the Ethiopians. The Italians had already taken control of Eritrea, Tigray, Somaliland. But the Italians, like the Dutch commandos who used Khoi militiamen to commit genocide against the San, in the course of their land grabbing, the Italians used Eritrean collaborators who were known as Askaris in their divide and rule attack on the Ethiopians. And during our modern struggle against apartheid, those of us who served in the liberation forces and that, people who betrayed us and collaborated, they were called Askaris too. So we have a long history of Askari collaborators in South Africa, but in all African societies, from Khoi to Zulu, from the earliest wars in the 17th century right through to the War of Liberation from 1961 to 1993. The Berlin Conference signatories, the Italian, Spanish, British, Portuguese, French, German, Belgian colonial armies all used Askaris. And what happened at this battle, the Battle of Adwa, was a military victory for Ethiopia in 1896 against the Italians and their Eritrean Askari collaborators. It ended the first Italian-Ethiopian war, and the battle that took place at Adwa was in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, and it prevented the colonization of Ethiopia at that time by Italy. The Ethiopian forces of around 100,000 riflemen and 20,000 swordsmen and lancers outnumbered the Italian forces 5-1, including their 14,000 Askaris. The Italians were not only defeated with huge losses of lives and many taken prisoners, but they were chased, just like the Khoi chased people from Rondebosch all the way to Salt River. They chased people from Tigray and Ethiopia all the way back to Eritrea. As a direct result of this battle, Italy signed the Treaty of Addis Ababa, recognizing Ethiopia as an independent African state. And this directly challenged the Berlin carve-up of Africa, and it became an inspiration for all liberations in Africa, liberation struggles in Africa. It was the greatest challenge to European invincibility since the 1510 defeat of Francisco de Almeida in Salt River. And it binds Salt River and Adwa as inspirations for Pan-African resistance across our continent. It's for this reason that we celebrate Adwa Day with pride, as an African Pride Day across Africa. What we should deeply learn from all that has been said is that there are a number of false paths that we are tricked into going down that are disastrous colonial and white supremacist traps. The false path of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and engaging in nation-speak is one of those. Another is firstism, primacy, or supremacy, a colonial doctrine that Bob Marley warned us about and called on us to ensure that it is permanently discredited until the philosophy which holds one people superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. There will be war everywhere. Another is the path of fascism that is closely linked to nationalism and ethnic and race glorification. Fascism is the greatest threat once more today. Now, in 1936, we saw how fascism is an enemy of African liberation. When Italy invaded Ethiopia and rolled back the Battle of Adwa gains. Fascism today, led by Donald Trump, has one of its aims, the recolonization by white supremacists of countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. White South Africans are cheering Trump and calling on the USA to come and liberate them from black South Africans. You know, they may say from the ANC, but that is a code name, from black South Africans. That's what they say. We cannot afford to be divided. Some amongst us are already selling out and mischievously working with our oppressors. We should never entertain any of these false paths as having anything to do with the liberation of Africa's indigenous people. And I thank you for your patience.
Wasn't there a woman leader at the Battle of Adwa?
I don't know about the Battle of Adwa, but I can tell you that there was one hell of a woman leader in Angola. The Queen, what is her name?
Nzinga.
And you know, the Angolans, maybe of all of the African countries, suffered the worst raiding of people and children as enslaved. You know, Brazil and Latin America, Venezuela, and so on, as well as the United States. A larger number of Africans came from Angola. They literally denuded Angola of its children, and she took up the battle. and she was pretty victorious in her time. So there are many women leaders across Africa. I just personally don't know about Adwa. You might well be right.
There was a woman at Adwa.
Yeah. So, you know,
I just wanted to
men and
throw that
women in Africa.
as we're decolonizing,
Yes.
to remember the role of women.
Yes, absolutely. You know, if we look in our own South African history, right from, you know, people talk about Krotoa, and sometimes they talk of her in patronizing terms. But here was a youngster. She was 10, 12 years old when Van Riebeeck didn't take her as a child to their bosom, as the family, as some of the Europeans want to tell us. She was taken into servitude for Van Riebeeck's wife. He states so in his own writing, that he took her in as a servant. But she was highly talented. She could speak 4 languages and that. So he began to use her. Now at that time, women in men's world politics just wasn't there. So here's a young black woman, a linguist who becomes a diplomat and an emissary, and she spends 10 years doing that. And she ends up being abused in all sorts of ways. And sometimes we focus on that. But just think about this. She had to go out with parties of men to meet with her own people, and she had to do interpretation. And if you read Van Riebeeck's diaries very carefully, you'll see he uses a peculiar phrase. He says that she was playing the long bow. And I puzzled over this phrase for a long time, and I did a lot of research on it. And eventually I found that it was a 17th century slang term. Playing the long bow essentially meant that she was playing them, that she was telling them what they wanted to hear, rather than, and so she was advocating for her people while having this cover of being, now that's one hell of a skill, and a very dangerous scenario to be in. And Van Riebeeck eventually catches her out, because he makes a note when he's, you know, he left here in disgrace, and someone being the founder of South Africa. He leaves here in disgrace, but before he leaves, he writes a paragraph and he says there are things that he needs to warn the next head about concerning Krotoa, but it's something that he can't put down in writing. It has to be done by word of mouth. So she goes from being heroized to being the villain. And we see that she very carefully negotiates this terrain, because she knows that when Van Riebeeck goes, she's on her own. He afforded her some kind of patronage. So she decides to marry a European. Not because they were greatly in love. In fact, the records show, and you know, Sylvia Vollenhoven did some research in the Netherlands, was that this man, Van Meerhof, used to beat her up all the time. And essentially what she did was to try and protect herself by this marriage. It didn't really work, because they immediately imprisoned her on Robben Island with this guy who there was constantly beating her up. And then he was, within 2 years he was gone, and then he dies on an expedition. So it didn't really help her at the end of the day. And she had these children too. And she was treated terribly in that last, she only lived, 32 years. And her life can be sort of, divided up into these 3 parts. But the remarkableness of this young woman and what she was able to do at a time when even European women couldn't do that kind of thing. We lose sight of some of these gems in our history. When we look at people like Maya Angelou of Bengal, there's a whole range of them, Katharina from Coromandel and from Malabar. These women in early Cape society wielded huge power. The first woman that owned Camps Bay, title deed, her name was Swart Maria Evan, because she was so black. Her parents were both from Benin, so she was an African woman, tall, black, and she had, I think, 4 farms when she died in the smallpox epidemic. Her grandson became the first owner of Klein Constantia. When we look at these powerful black woman figures in our history, and take cognizance of it, we notice that they're airbrushed out. To this day, and it's up to us. I wrote a booklet called The Black Roots of the Vine, which tell the black history of winemaking in South Africa. It's available free online if you Google it in PDF form. I've tried to ensure that he's showing me the watch. I talk too much, sorry, but yeah, you know, Megan, you're absolutely right. You know, there's this whole feminine side of African struggles that we sometimes paper over, airbrush out, and we do it at our peril. Because that same unity that I talked about should be the unity of African men and women, and not just the unity across ethnicities and languages and so on and so on.
Thank you, everyone. Just a short announcement. Okay, so just on that question, sorry, Mr. I'm filling in. So in Ethiopia, when they brought the treaty of world, I don't know how to, world Chile or something. So it was written in Amharic and it was written in Italian. The Italian version had a different narrative to what the Amharic one, right? With the Gers, I think they were still speaking Gers at that time. But it's the same script, a truly indigenous African script. We're currently using a Roman script, even for indigenous languages. The Amharic script is extremely powerful, you know. But okay, that's another language issue. What we wanted to say is that, so Empress Taitu was the spouse of Emperor Menelik. She is actually the one that took the treaty. Don't know if she had an advisor that could speak Italian or whatever, but according to her, she was not going to be a vassal state of Italy, according to the treaty, and she ripped it apart. And she said, we will go to war with you. So she took Menelik to the battle and said, listen here. And her army, she was a leader of an battalion, of an army of battalions. Sorry. So she had her own background and she had her own power, regional power and warlords, you know, it's imperial politics. So she brought her people to the battlefield. The Menelik had his. So that's, and then we also have Nyabingi. I think, I don't know where the Nyabingi queen was, it in Uganda. So the Nyabingi, us as Nyabingi warriors, it's actually coming from the spirit of Queen Nyabingi. It's also given to an Italian journalist that wrote a article, and he said that in Africa, you know, the Nyabingi warriors, blah blah blah, but it was it was for the Jamaican Gleaner then, reprinted it, and that's where the Rastaman in Jamaica identified with Nyabingi, and therefore, and now Nyabingi is an international community from that space to a global space. We in Asia, you know, Rastas are in every country, in Europe, in America, in Americas, in Africa. You can go to Asia also, and there's a connection, which is the Nyabingi, which is actually the drums and the chanting. It's war chants, it's spiritual chants, it's hymns that we actually chant for 10 years with the Adwa parade, you know. So but Queen Nyabingi is a black, powerful woman that also fought against the colonial forces. So that is just something I wanted to. And then, so tomorrow, thank you everyone. I just want to announce.
By the way, there's also the women warriors of Dahomey. Yes. Men in, you know, all of Africa.
Yeah, but they say that Dahomey, they say that people were actually catching slaves. The kingdom of Dahomey were actually selling slaves too. So there's also a contradiction. There's also a contradiction there, you know. But anyway, I wanted to announce that tomorrow we have the panel, same layout. I hope it starts at 6. We won't be having introductions of our partners and collaborators and co-constructors. 5 speakers. It's on the posters, doctors. Dr. Ashagametse wrote a paper about Adwa, Menelik, and nationalisms, because currently nationalisms are creating conflict in Ethiopia. The Tigrayans, the Oromos, Amaras, they're all fighting against each other because of the federal state. Anyway, similar to things happening in the Congo with M23 and those people, and the divide, and the Hutus and the Tutsis, and it's constantly ethnic politics, unfortunately. So Dr. Ashagametse, Dr. Kasibe, Annalise Kotze from Ezeko, the lady from the Congo, and Masitole as our 5 panel speakers. Also 15 to 20 minutes. Then we also want the Q&A. Unfortunately, we couldn't do a Q&A, but I trust that the future will provide space once we get a topic, a theme, if not next year for but thank you. It was very insightful, very inspirational. King Locks, Elder Locks has also left. So that's that. Then that's Thursday, Friday from 1 till 4. We at the Ezeko Museums in Queen Victoria Street, screening 4 critical documentaries on issues of land, Pan-Africanism, because the one documentary covers the agrarian struggle of women in Eswatini and 2 other countries. Apologies, Kurt. What's the other 2 countries?
Mozambique and Zambia.
Mozambique. And then we do a dispossessed Cape Colony, Cape Town narrative of a young, at that time, still youthful artist and his growth 12 years ago. It's called The Unseen Ones, or The Unseen. Then we have What the Soil Remembers by Mr. Van Wyk Adrian. It's also doing the festival circuit at the moment. And then the other one, Beauty for Ashes, which is about the struggle of artisan miners in the Northern Cape Kleinzee area. Award-winning, short, radical documentaries, resistance documentaries, done by Azania Rising Production, our leadership in the sector, in the space. So that's that. Then we come back to the castle. Here behind the castle, Mr. Gilfellen and the space has given us the space here. You can actually come through the parking lot on that side, just around the corner. The gate is open. We'll be camping and making fire. So we're going to be sleeping on the ground. Yes, we'll sleep. We're going to sleep on the castle, behind the castle. We're going to make a fire. We're going to have some Bushmen practitioners that know what they are invoking. We are going to heal the castle space, the gat waar ons so bang gemaak was. The trauma in the space, and commemorating Salt River and the warriors of Salt River, right? And we're doing it within a ceremonial space. It's going to be very pure intentions, liberatory intentions, emancipatory intentions. Then the following day, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, for the decade of Adwa Salt River. Was Adwa just Adwa for maybe 6-7 years, and in the 8th year we incorporated Adwa X Salt River Victory Parade, right? So it connects that continental, the Horn, with the South, and as Mr. Mellet said, Adwa inspired global Pan-African movements, and Salt River is closer to home, hence as South Africans. But all of these things have global nuances, and I give thanks, we give thanks for this space, we give thanks for all co-creators, co-constructors, collaborators, and everyone giving their efforts and their resources. Thank you unto our elders for blessing us. We are fortunate, that's all I can say. I and I, it's I and you, the tangible, the intangible, the abstract, the concrete, the us, the I, the ours, the mine, I and I. So it bridges that space, it's personal and it's interpersonal, and it's, anyway. So when I say I mean us, and I mean I, and we one. Anyway, I just want to ask, before we leave, we'll lock up, just all the stakeholders, can we just take a group photo for the inaugural, just the stakeholders, so we can just have that and caption it and have it in the archives. So if we can just next to the speakers. We're going to leave the speakers here till tomorrow, because tomorrow we're just continuing at 6 o'clock again. So please share the posters if you have them, tell them that it's extremely enlightening, and then we take it from there. Thank you for all, even the latecomers.
No, it's not done. Yeah, it's
So can you please help us be a co-constructor of the photo?
yes.